G'day mates, it's Busta here, and I would like to give Private Internet Access, or PIA for short, a shout out for sponsoring this episode. So, most people underestimate the importance of protecting your digital identity when accessing the internet. But with PIA VPN, you can do more than just basic protection. PIA allows you to secure your financial transactions, browse the internet without leaving a trace, and unlock tons of blocked international streaming content on Netflix, Hulu, or Prime Video. And you can do all of this without a single server logging your activity. Founded in 2010, PIA is a leading VPN provider with over 100 million paying customers all over the world. And if you don't know, VPN stands for Virtual Private Network. Private Internet Access allows you to encrypt your connection, so anything that you do online is private and secure. Your internet service provider, the government, and nefarious hackers too will no longer have access to your data. PIA offers unlimited access to over 3,200 VPN servers in 45 countries. You can use PIA to protect your digital identity, hide your IP address, download safely, secure your bank transactions, access streaming services, and stay completely untraceable online. PIA features dedicated apps for all the major platforms: Windows, Mac, Linux, Android, iOS, Amazon Fire Stick, and more. You can protect up to 10 devices at the same time, and PIA does not keep logs of your activity, ever. The service is trusted by huge companies like Forbes, Gizmodo, and Wired, and there's also a 30-day money-back guarantee. So, for a limited time, get private internet access for only $2.59 a month, plus 3 extra months for free at privateinternetaccess.com/scared. That's privateinternetaccess.com/scared to surf the internet safely. Back in the late 2000s, I had just finished my useless degree and was struggling to find work. I was living in a Midwestern college town where everyone and their dog had some higher level education, so it wasn't uncommon to find people with PhDs working for like $10 an hour at a cashier, but the town was cute and affordable, so people liked to stay post-graduation. I found a decent job at a coffee shop over the summer, but once the fall semester started, my hours were cut and I was replaced with cheaper, younger baristas. A co-worker suggested that I start nannying. I wasn't particularly interested in working with kids, but she assured me that it was good money, and so I decided to join a website for nannies and babysitters, and very quickly was contacted by a family. I met the parents for a quick interview and was hired fairly quickly. The pay was excellent and the hours were great, 8 a.m. to 4 p.m, so I had the evenings to myself and free weekends. Both parents were professors at the local university, and they had 2 children and were expecting their third very soon. Henry was 8 and Jane was 3. Both children were incredibly intelligent, Jane particularly so, and had the vocabulary of a much older child. I was primarily responsible for her, since Henry spent most of his day in school. Jane was a very serious little girl, though. She could carry on very in-depth conversations, and I used to joke with her that she was like a 60-year-old trapped in a toddler's body. Henry was a beautiful kid, I'll give him that. He had thick, dark, curly hair, long eyelashes, piercing blue eyes, and dimples. He has the ability to be sweet, loving, and funny, but I quickly learned that this was a skill set that he only used when it benefited him. Overall, Henry was a true monster. Now, I have an older brother and 2 younger brothers, so I'm familiar with sibling relationships, and I know fighting is normal. But Henry, he tormented Jane. I've never seen a child get so much joy out of causing pain, fear, and discomfort to another human being. He loved nothing more than to terrify her with stories or monsters or ghosts. He had convinced Jane that there was a demon living in their basement, and she refused to go down with me when I had to do the laundry. Over a couple of weeks, I had slowly got her to sit on the bathroom step and play while I folded clothes so I could keep an eye on her. She was proud of her bravery too, but when Henry came home and saw that she had conquered her fears, he made it his duty to terrify her even more, and all progress was soon lost. He was so terribly mean to his little sister that I was worried about her physical safety when he was home. He would constantly taunt her, pinch her, threaten her, and destroy her belongings. I despised the hour that I had with him every evening after picking him up from school. The entire time would be filled with crying and screaming and his refusal to obey anything that I asked him to do. I would try to tell him off occasionally. I'd say that he couldn't act however he wished, that he was a child, I was the adult, etc. I would say, "You aren't the king of this castle, Henry." This is my parents used to say to me. And he would say, "I am the king. I'm King Henry. Off with your head." He would always respond like that, and he was pretty much right. I didn't have any less control over him than his parents, too. They, Elizabeth and Michael, were absolutely clueless. Dad was work-obsessed and incredibly hands-off. Mum was a sweetheart, but also a doormat, and allowed both kids to just walk all over her. They had no discipline whatsoever, so a lot of Henry's behaviors, they sort of made sense. Why would he need to behave if no one ever made him? I was shocked to watch how Henry treated his mother, though, and how she allowed him to mock her, call her names, and act aggressively towards her. It wasn't unusual for him to tell her that she looked ugly and needed to go change or put her hair down, and she'd always go and do it. He threatened to punch her stomach if she didn't do what he wanted. He'd pinch her in the back of her arms when she displeased him. She made excuse after excuse for his behavior, calling him exceptionally bright and bored and having a difficult time adjusting to her pregnancy. When the baby was born, though, things got even worse. Thankfully, he didn't attempt to hurt baby Peggy, but his aggression and violence towards his mother and Jane got so much worse. One afternoon, he found his mum's sewing needles and tried to trick Jane into sitting on one. When it didn't work, he just stuck one right into her tiny arm. She screamed, and I freaked out and removed it and called both parents ASAP. Elizabeth arrived home, concerned for Jane, and for the first time seemed at least frustrated by Henry's behavior. She attempted to scold him, and he became so enraged, though, that he started punching her in her newly postpartum stomach. She only responded by crying and hugging him and asking him why he was so angry and wanted to hurt his sister. He responded with a cold, "I'm angry because you should have miscarried them both. They both should have died inside of you." My jaw must have hit the floor that day. Elizabeth stopped crying and just stared at him, and then me. I assumed that they were going to potentially get this kid some help, but when I approached the subject the next day, I was brushed off and told that they had had a talk with Henry and it was just an outburst due to an unrelated issue at school. Another excuse, really. Henry continued to torment the entire family, but then he started to target me as well. For the past few months, he mostly ignored me. He'd occasionally call me ugly or throw the laundry I'd just folded all over the room, but he had yet to get physical with me. This all changed one day when I unfortunately had the day off from school, so I got to spend the entire day with him home, while also caring for Jane and Peggy. It was challenging, but by 10 a.m., he was bored of torturing Jane and went to go and play in his room. The rest of the morning went decently, with him occupied in his room until lunch, where he spilled his plate all over the table because I didn't cut his crust the right way. I just cleaned it up. I had admitted my defeat weeks ago anyway. I couldn't enforce any rules or boundaries if the parents didn't back me up. But I put the girls down for a nap, and Henry asked me to read him a story. For the first time, too, he was calm and genuinely sweet with me. I read him the BFG, and he cuddles a bit closer. I thought for a bit that maybe this kid just really needs more one-on-one time. I was about 30 minutes into the book when I felt a small hand reach under my skirt and touch my stomach. I looked at him and he stared at me. I gently picked up his hand and told him that it wasn't appropriate to touch other people without asking. He seemed angry, but let me continue reading. I noticed that he had stopped paying attention to the story and was sort of looking me all over. Before I could ask him what was wrong, his hand was under my shirt and making his way for my breast when I yanked it away and stood up. I tried not to yell, told him that that was incredibly inappropriate and that he's never to touch anyone underneath their clothes ever again like that. Henry looked at me and then he said, "I can touch whoever I want, wherever I want, whenever I want. You can't stop me, and no one can stop me." I was creeped out, obviously, and felt violated. I know that he was just a kid, but just imagine how that feels as an adult woman. I know children aren't the best with personal space boundaries, but Henry was almost 9 now, and I knew that he knew what he did wasn't appropriate or okay. The intent behind it, honestly, seemed sinister. I ended our story session quickly after that, and I tried to get through the rest of the day. I was really glad that he'd be back at school for the rest of the week, but I did decide to let his mother know because it felt weird not to. She thought that it was funny, though. She kind of chuckled and said that he's a very sensory-orientated kid and it was just trying to be affectionate or something. At that point, I honestly decided that I was never going to talk sense into these parents and I needed to look for another job quickly. I knew that I was going to put my 2 weeks in pretty soon. I was very sad because I was close to Jane and Peggy and felt like I was abandoning them, but I had discussed Henry's behavior with my roommate, and she was concerned about potential legal ramifications for me if Henry did something to one of the girls on my watch. I came back to work on Monday, and Jane, she had a black eye. Henry had accidentally punched her in the eye during an argument. I was really sad for her, and I asked her what happened later, and she told me that she was playing in her room when Henry came in, took her doll, and when she tried to grab it back, he punched her square in the eye and just laughed at her. Henry was so evil at home, though, that I wondered why his teacher never seemed to mention any behavioral issues in the classroom. One evening, though, while picking her up, I mentioned Henry was very difficult at home and wondered if she had any issues with him at school. She said no, that he was actually very well behaved. Had no issues and had a lot of friends, in fact. I was really surprised by that. I assumed Henry was disturbed and that his poor behavior just transferred into class. But the teacher denied all of this. I quite frankly didn't believe her, so one afternoon the girls and I left early and arrived at his school so I could see how he interacted. But she was completely right. He sat at his desk quietly, raised his hand, seemed genuinely friendly to his peers. And for some reason, this stark difference in Henry's personality from home to school really terrified me, even more than normal. Initially, I thought that he was just a disturbed kid, but at that moment, I realized how truly in control he was. Henry wasn't just an angry child with severe behavioral issues. Henry was just a mean person who knew when and where he could get away with his favorite pastime, causing misery. Thankfully, I managed to find an entry-level position in a field related to my degree in spring. I have my 2 weeks, and Elizabeth was upset, but she understood. Henry, however, was absolutely livid. He made sure to tell me daily how much he hated me and how glad he was that I was leaving and how he hoped that I would die. I was feeling less than patient with his antics, so sometimes I replied a little more sarcastically than I should have to a 9-year-old child. But on my last day, Friday, my treat to Elizabeth and Michael was to let them have a date night. I picked up Henry from school at 2:55 and we headed home. Henry refuses to talk to me. He wouldn't even look at me. He wouldn't even acknowledge me. I thought that may not be the worst way to spend the next 6 hours, to be honest, when it happened, but we arrived home, and shortly after, Elizabeth and Michael came in and started to get ready for their date. The baby was about 5 months old at this point, and they hadn't been out since her birth the fall before. Typical Henry refused to speak to anyone, and Elizabeth got worried and thought about cancelling the date, not wanting to see Henry upset, but I wrongly assured her that things would be fine, and they left around 6 p.m. The older two went to bed at around 8 p.m, and the baby an hour before, so I only had to make it about maybe 2 more hours with Henry. We ordered pizza, and he refused to eat. He just sat there and sulked in his chair. I let them watch about 30 minutes of the Magic School Bus on my laptop, a treat since they didn't own a TV, while I bathed the baby, gave her a bottle, and put her down in her crib. And quite honestly, I was pretty surprised I didn't even hear a peep coming from downstairs. No crying or screaming, and I felt a bit victorious that Henry was so stubborn in his silent treatment that he didn't even realize how easy he was making this evening. When I got into the living room, I then noticed that Henry had a sly grin on his face. The first one that I had seen all day. I let the episode finish. I took the computer and noticed it was incredibly sticky. I quickly realized that it was honey and that Henry had gone into the kitchen and put a solid glob in his hands and rubbed it all over the bottom of the back of the computer. I was just relieved, though, that he didn't get the keyboard, to be honest. I took it into the kitchen, though, and wiped it off, and then I heard Jane scream. I ran into the living room, and Henry was sat there with Jane right next to him, with her hand squeezed tightly with his right hand, and one of the kitchen knives in the other hand. I froze. I demanded that he put the knife down immediately and let his sister go. I told him that this wasn't funny and that he'd crossed a line. He, on the other hand, just smiled. I went to grab Jane, and she cried, and Henry just chuckled. He said, "I really scared you. You know, I could have killed her while you were upstairs, and you would have never known." The blood drained from my face. The anger that I felt towards him turned into fear, and then the realization that, you know what, he was right. I felt really stupid. I rarely left them alone together because it usually ended in Jane being pinched, pushed, slapped, or bit, but I guess that I let my guard down given his docile behavior all day. I just started to cry and screamed at him to never ever do that again, and to go straight to his room. He just sat and stared and went to the kitchen and put the knife back, and then quietly went upstairs. I was obviously super shaken up and was still trying to calm down as I bathed Jane and got her ready for bed. I told her that I was sorry and asked if he had hurt her, and she said that he hadn't. I was about as angry with myself as I was at him. I could see Henry in his room playing with his Hot Wheels set, and I told him that he needed to have the lights out by 8:30 and that he could tuck himself in. He stared at me and shut the door to his room, and I prayed that that would be the last time that I saw him for the night. I got Jane into bed and was reading her a story when I heard his door creak open. I got up and it looked as if he had creaked the door, but the lights were off. I continued reading until I suddenly heard Peggy start to gently cry, but she sounded close. I immediately sprung up, and outside the doorframe, I could see Henry holding the baby over the banister. I couldn't even scream. I've never moved so fast in my life. I got to Peggy quickly, and I grabbed her, and I just ran back into Janie's room. I shut the door, and I shouted at Henry, asking him why he would do this, which was a stupid question. I knew why. To torment me. To make me realize how easily he could access his younger sisters and potentially hurt them. Henry could have dropped Peggy, and he could have hurt Jane with that knife, but he didn't. And I don't think that was ever the intention. He just wanted to let me know that I wasn't doing my job nearly as well as I thought, and that in the end, he was the one, always in control. It took a while to calm myself down and the girls and get them to sleep. It was close to 9 by that time, and I left their bedrooms and saw that Henry was still up in his room, reading on his bed. And at that, I just kind of looked at him. I was so relieved that this was my last day dealing with this kid and all of his terrible antics, but I also felt really sad and scared for his sisters. I told him that it was time for bed and that I was going to tell his parents about what had happened. He didn't respond. I turned out the lights, and then I heard him call my name. And he said, "You can tell them, but it's a waste of your time. You're just lucky. You're really lucky. I can do what I want. I can hurt who I want. I can touch who I want. You're all really lucky." And at that, I just shut the door and left. Elizabeth and Michael came home a little later than expected, and they paid me. I didn't mention what happened that night because it felt, well, pointless, but the next day I ended up sending a text. I got a long response from Elizabeth full of excuses about Henry like normal, and she even insinuated that I lied. And I was over it. I was over all of them. And yes, I did end up contacting CPS, but I'm not sure if anything ever came of it. I don't believe that Henry was being abused or anything. I've told this story to others and people always ask me that, but no, I don't think that that was the cause. I honestly think that Henry was born a sociopath, and his parents were enablers who never made him accountable for his actions, and the two together created a monster. I didn't hear from them for over a decade. I moved across the country. I'm married now and I have kids. My son is almost 6 years of age and he has two little sisters that are 3. They fight, but he loves them and is really protective and knows what a healthy relationship between siblings should look like. Anyways, a few weeks ago I got a friend request on Facebook from Elizabeth. She looks the same, a few more lines, but still very elegant and pretty. Her profile picture consists of herself and her now 4 children. I glanced across the photo until my eye caught a young man with thick curly hair and bright blue eyes. It was Henry. Henry ended up as stunning looking as expected. He's about to be a sophomore at a well-known elite American university. He plays for their soccer team and is majoring in business. He has a girlfriend and seems popular in his fraternity. And this is all I can gather through his public Facebook posts. Who knows? Maybe he learned accountability and grew out of his mean-spirited and manipulative way. I can only hope that that's true for his siblings' sake, as well as the well-being of those around him. For now, though, my family is thousands of miles away from Henry, and I honestly don't care if I ever see him again. But if I ever do, I handled him then, and I'll definitely handle him again. I never expected this to happen to me specifically because, for some naive reason, I believe that I just couldn't be targeted. The same goes for me thinking that my family couldn't be targeted for any malicious reason too. So, the story begins with my mum, my little brother, 6 years old at the time, and myself, being 19. Our washing machine broke at our house and my mum refused to fix it because all of us were always running up the bills anyways, when we used the machine constantly. So naturally, we started going to the laundromat to wash all of our clothes instead. Now, the laundromat that we've been using has been the same one that we've used for nearly a decade. I have a big family consisting of 8 people, all boys except for my mum, bless her soul. So we usually went to the laundromat for washing clothes, even when the machine was working. Even when we moved houses, we still used the same laundromat because of loyalty reasons. The owners knew us and watched us grow up and were really friendly with us when changes were happening around the laundromat. Now, I recently got some new earbuds that I was itching to test out for my phone, and the laundromat is the perfect place to be able to play some music quietly and wash and dry and fold clothes without causing any issues. The routine started off as normal, with my mum and I putting clothes in separate washers, depending on the colour, size and thickness. My little brother, who was with us at the time, was just spinning around playing with any of the other kids that may have been there. We were there in the middle of the day when most people were at work, so it was nearly empty, save for a few independent mums and I think one kid. Putting the clothes into the machines, which were a few garbage bags full, only took us about 15 to 20 minutes. I remember seeing my little brother running up and down the aisles, having got this really bouncy ball from a dispenser that the laundromat had. But during this, both my mum and I noticed that a silver car had pulled up the front of the laundromat, and had been sitting there for a long duration whilst no one got out to prepare to wash clothes. Nothing super unusual, but just a little bit odd. Even I've been known to sit in the car for half an hour just dreading washing clothes, so I didn't think too much of it. At the time, the clothes had been in the washers and started, so we just all kind of sat around and waited for the clothes to finish washing so we could put them in the dryers and head home after folding. So far, so good. I decided to put my earbuds in, listening to my favorite 200 plus song list that I still haven't sorted. But when I listen to music, I tend to walk around and not pay attention to much, either inside or outside. Though I always stayed on the front sidewalk right in front of the doors of the laundromat when I did go outside. So I headed outside with my little brother, and my mum was still inside. And I was pacing while slightly dancing to some music that I was listening to, not really caring what others thought about me, and I only stopped when I heard a car honk near my left, making me startle pretty badly and stare at the car that scared me. And it was the silver car that had been parked there earlier. Still, no one had gotten out of the car at this point. I looked over at the car, taking out one of my earbuds and trying to see who honked their horn, because it was right near me. The driver's side tinted window rolled down on the car, and an older man was sitting in the seat, looking directly at me. I instantly got a bad vibe from this guy, because he looked like he was just too happy to see me for a complete stranger. My mum had walked outside to our car, which was about 2 cars away from this silver one, as she was getting something out but didn't notice that I was being talked to by this stranger. And here is how the conversation went. "Excuse me, young man. I'm a pastor over at the church here. I'm looking for some new musicians for our band because our other one's left." Me, hearing that he was a pastor, immediately put down my guard, as I had been to church before and that position is almost always a respected one. Well, I'm not really a musician, but I do know of someone that you can contact." He seemed satisfied with that answer, but he motioned for me to come closer, and I took a step towards the edge of the sidewalk, still not stepping off because I didn't want to get too close. Sorry, can you come closer? I can't quite hear you." Me, just speaking louder, says, "I said that I know of someone that you can contact. His name is Steve. He's actually a pianist and a saxophone player." I actually did know this guy because it was one of my best friend's fiancés, who was super talented with music and acting. The pastor just motioned me over to him again, but this time his facial expression was less approachable, not menacing, almost annoyed that I hadn't walked up to him yet. By now, my mum had looked up from her car, having gotten whatever she was looking for, and walked up the sidewalk talking to me. "Who's that? What do they want?" I don't know. They said that they're a pastor for a church here or something, and that they're looking for musicians." Immediately, my mum's expression turned serious and annoyed, saying to back away from the car and to tell him to go find someplace else to look for that. I looked back at the pastor, who was then glaring daggers at my mum, like legit scowling at her as if something he had planned had been ruined. I backed away from the sidewalk, glad that I hadn't stepped into the parking lot yet, and just shrugged my shoulders apologetically towards the silver car before turning around and walking back inside the laundromat. My mum followed me inside and asked me more about it later. She said that she had heard the car honk and that she saw the old guy talking to me, but the moment that it looked as if I was going to step into the parking lot, she intervened to stop me because the guy was super suspicious. I argued that I could take care of myself, being 19, but she didn't care. Also, we had my little brother still inside the laundromat, so it could have been a ploy to get me distracted in order to get to him, which is even scarier. The only doors to enter, too, were the ones that were directly in front of the laundromat, but our washers and dryers were in the far back corner. We continued to talk about it, laughing later about how weird it was that a pastor would come to a laundromat to ask for musicians for his church. Why didn't he just go to people in his church to ask for references? It only made it creepier that while we were folding up the clothes after we dried them, we had noticed that the car was gone and the pastor never got out of his car to wash any clothes after sitting in that parking lot for well over an hour. I honestly don't think that he would have been able to pull me through the car window or something because I'm a pretty tall dude, but I figured that maybe they just weren't after me, but actually after my little brother who was running around the laundromat the entire time. The place had an entire front wall of windows, so you could see clearly into the place, all the way into the back. Maybe that's the creepiest thing about it all. If this guy was trying to get one of us, it was pretty brazen. Oh, and by the way, I went and looked up the church to see if the pastor was telling the truth, but I was pretty shocked to find out that the pastor's picture that was online was nowhere near the same as the one that had approached us that day. It still gives me shivers. I was one of those kids that you would see walking around zoos or amusement parks, always wearing a leash. Those were already a thing 20 plus years ago, but less common, and were initially only tied around the wrist. In my case, I'll admit that it was a necessity. I would always start wandering off from the rest of the family, no matter what the situation. And this is one of the stories that led me to earning my leash. So, it happened when I was about 6 years old, and I went to the zoo with my mum and sisters. Before every family outing, my mum made sure to give me the talk about not walking off again or face the consequences. My mum was a pretty strict parent that made good on her promises too. She had to, being a single mother of 3. I didn't try to disobey her per se, but I often just didn't pay attention to the world and people around me. No different this day, I suppose, because I behaved and followed the group for a while, but then a butterfly garden caught my attention and off I was. When I finally realized that I separated myself from my mum and sisters again, I panicked and I started walking around the zoo looking for them. I was afraid of my mum's reaction more than anything else. After a while, I somehow got it in my head that if I could just walk out, find our car and wait there, my family would eventually find me. And so I did. I got lost within a couple of minutes, walking around a strange neighborhood looking for either our car or the way back to the zoo. Nothing looked familiar, and I started crying, and my mum was going to be so mad. Then this man came up to me, just normal looking, about 40 years old, asking me if I'm lost. I explained that I lost my family when I was visiting the zoo, and I'm looking for the way back. I couldn't believe my luck when this man told me that he had just come from the zoo and saw a family there standing near the entrance who were waiting for a little girl with blonde hair and a baseball cap. But it was still a few blocks away, so he proposed that I walked with him to his car and then we could drive the rest of the way back. And just the mention of his car finally made me a little hesitant. I told him that I wasn't allowed to get in a car with strangers. My mum would be so mad. He then said something like, that was true, but I looked smart enough to know that I could trust someone. I don't remember the exact words, but it was something like that. Also, he added that he spoke to my parents earlier when they were looking for me, so he's not a complete stranger. That just didn't seem right to me, though, and I asked him if he really talked to my dad, who had died a year before. And when he said that he did, I broke down crying just uncontrollably. I still didn't understand the situation that I was in. I was just really confused about everything and scared of how angry my mum was going to be after all of this. Finally, my crying caught the attention of the security guard of a parking building lot where we were standing next to, asking if there was something that he could help me with. The guy stepped aside with the security guard and started explaining the situation, but made it vaguely sound like he was my father and we were looking for his wife. The security guard seemed to believe him, pointing us in the right direction towards the zoo. The man thanks the security guard and proceeds to take my hand and walk away. The security guard takes a look at me and asks me in a comforting and friendly adult-to-child kind of way why I'm still crying. I tell him that my dad is dead. He looks really confused for a few seconds and then asks if this man is not my dad. I tell him again, no, my dad is dead. And in a split second, his whole face and posture changes and he turns to look at this guy who's trying to explain that he never actually said that he was my dad, that the security guard must have misunderstood and that he was just helping me find my mum. The security guard said that he appreciated the man's help, but he would take me off his hands now, and the guy immediately just took off. I don't think that there was much else the security guard could have done, to be honest. But in the end, I explained the whole situation, and after making a phone call, he walked me to the entrance of the zoo, which was just around the corner from the parking building, by the way. From there, we were brought to the security guard's office, where my mum and sisters were already waiting. I feel extremely lucky for the security guard being at the right place at the right time that day, and very grateful for the extra second of time that he took to understand what was going on. That obviously made all the difference. I live in a small town in Denmark with a population of roughly 3,000 people where nothing really ever happens, and the following scared the entire town half to death. So back in 2005 or so, when I was still in kindergarten, a strange and agitated man who was a father to one of the children came and demanded my teacher that he wanted to see his daughter and take her out of school. My teacher could see in his eyes that something just wasn't right and that he was extremely upset. He therefore denied him to see his daughter, and after a very uncomfortable discussion, the father eventually gave up, walked to his car without looking back, and drove home. My teacher grew very worried and decided to call the local police to go out and check the family's house, and later that day, it came on the news that the father had murdered his own wife with a gun, and afterwards shot himself too. At the time, my best friend lived next door to the family, and he has since told me that he could hear the mother screaming in a very horrifying way, followed by 3 gunshots, a grown man crying his heart out, 10 seconds of silence, and then finally 1 more shot. It really creeps me out just thinking about this, and I feel really sorry for the daughter who was left an orphan at such an early stage in life. I really do not know what would have happened to the daughter if my teacher had not stopped the man from taking her home with him that day. And I hope that she's having a decent life, wherever she is. So I, a female, was 15 at the time, grade 10 and sophomore in high school. I grew up in a small farming town. Population at the time was 1,400 in Washington State, USA. I met Ricky, a male, in shop class, where we flirted daily. I was the only girl in the class and assumed that was why he was flirting with me. I also assumed that he was 16 since he was in my grade but had his license when he was actually 19. In school, I was popular in that I was friends with just about everyone, but Ricky was very handsome and very popular for actually being cool. So, I was super excited that he paid attention to me and even started flirting with me, even though, like I said, I figured it was because I was the only girl in class. I'll admit that I led him on in a big way. I figured nothing would ever happen between he and I, since he was really good looking and popular, and had beautiful girls just throwing themselves at him in the hallways and other classes. So, the flirting had become more and more sexual, with us talking about actually having sex, even though I actually had no intention and thought it was never going to happen anyway. The shop class had a regular classroom in the high school where we took attendance and tests, and then the shop itself was located about 100 yards away from the main building, I'd say. The high school parking lot was on the opposite side of the high school building from the shop class. Our school had open campus as well, meaning that students could leave campus during lunch if they had the signed form filled in with the office. So, in late spring of that year, 1997, Ricky and I were flirting one day when he suggested we actually go through with it. He suggested that we leave right after that class, during lunch, and head to his house. I don't know why I agreed, other than realizing that I had talked and talked about it for weeks and couldn't admit that I'd been lying the whole time. So after class, he and I left the shop and we walked around the back of the school to the parking lot. We got in his nice truck and we drove away from the school. I was freaking out internally because, 1, my friends were expecting me to leave campus with them and were waiting by my locker, and 2, was I really about to have sex for the first time with one of the hottest guys in school? We drove through town and went to his house about a half a mile from campus. We went inside, and as soon as the door closed, he started kissing me. To this day, this first kiss is one of the best I've ever had. I couldn't completely appreciate it at the time because, well, I was still freaking out. We made our way to his bed and continued kissing for 45 minutes while he kept trying to get me to go further with him. He had stripped down to his boxers, but I still had everything on, including shoes and jacket. He wasn't pushy or anything, but just trying to go with what we had discussed for weeks. After 45 minutes, I said that I just wanted to go back to school. He sighed, put his clothes back on, and then we left. We drove to the school in silence, and when we got to the parking lot, he asked if I was okay. I said yes and got out, and I walked quickly inside. Out of my peripheral vision, I saw his truck leaving the parking lot. Lunch was still going on, so I went to my locker, grabbed my books for my next class, and I went in the classroom to read until class started. Shortly before class started, two of my friends that I was supposed to meet for lunch came in and they asked if I was okay and where I had gone. I said that I was fine and didn't want to talk about it. One of the girls then left to go to her class, but the other girl, Ali, was in the class with me, so she stayed. About halfway through the class, I just decided to tell Ali about what had happened and made her promise not to tell anyone. She was concerned, obviously, and made sure that I realized that I'd put myself in a dangerous situation, and no one knew where I was or even with whom. To be honest, I hadn't even thought about that until she pointed it out. The next few days, Ricky went to school but skipped shop class. I was fine with this too because I didn't really want to see him, mostly because I was just embarrassed. But Ricky started coming to class again and tried talking to me, but I was quite rude. For about a week, in fact, shop class consisted of him trying to talk to me ignoring him sighing, and then just walking away. After that, I was much more civil, but never went back to flirting with him. He started approaching me between classes and even during lunch, just being friendly and lightly flirting, but I never returned the flirting again. Random groups of girls started approaching me and asking what was going on between Ricky and I. Why did he like me, and why was he ignoring them, etc. And I just didn't really have any answers. The second to last week of school, Ricky hung around me often, but was really quiet. And then he told me that I was the first girl to ever turn him down. During the last week of school, he went back to hanging out with his friends and flirting with the pretty girls, and I was quite relieved, mostly because I felt guilty for leading him on like that, and also guilty for putting myself in that situation. About midway through the summer holiday, I actually ran into Ali, and she asked if I had heard about Ricky. And I told her that no, I hadn't. And she said that Ricky was on the run from the police for the attempted murders of 2 men. She said that she heard that it was a drug deal gone bad. I was shocked, and I let my imagination go wild with thoughts of what if. I mean, I assumed that if he was willing to murder 2 men, what would have stopped him from raping or even murdering me? A year later, one of the men died from complications from his wounds, so the charges were actually changed to 1 charge of attempted murder and 1 charge of murder in the first degree. I later found out that it wasn't actually a drug deal gone bad, but was actually a failed cartel hit. I have more info on that, and why I don't believe Ricky would have actually harmed me, or pretty much anyone, if it hadn't have been for his dad's employer, but this story's pretty long, so I'll finish it here. I don't really know what happened to Ricky, and I heard that he fled to California and then possibly to Mexico. But one thing I do know is that he was never caught by the police.